Welcome back to Scouching's 2024 Prospect Pipeline series, and today we're looking at the Toronto Maple Leafs. And what we do in this series is we basically take a bird's eye view of all the prospects in an NHL team system and see how things look going into a new season. But before we get into it, we need to define what a prospect is and what these tiers mean. So a prospect is a player that is within 5 years of their first year of NHL draft eligibility, who also have not been on an NHL team for more than a full season. So a guy like Matthew Knies is not going to be in this video, outside of me just mentioning him now. And in terms of the tiers, we start at the franchise tier, which is players that you absolutely do not want to trade. Think Connor McDavid, think Sidney Crosby. Next tier down, you've got your core players who really do a great job surrounding those players that you really don't want to have to trade unless you absolutely have to. Then you have your depth category, which are players that play night in, night out in your second, third, fourth line that don't look out of place in the NHL at all for 82 games a season. And then you have your maybes category, which are players that have a lot of upside, but maybe a lot of risk in order to hit that upside, or maybe a little bit more of a limited upside, but might not have quite enough to get there in the NHL at the end of the day. So for Toronto, we're going to have to skip down a couple of tiers and go to the depth category. And here we have Easton Cowan, Ben Danford, and Fraser Minten, a series of top 40 picks that the Toronto Maple Leafs have made over the last few years. I'm a fan of all of these players. I think there's a very high likelihood that Ben Danford becomes an NHL player of some kind, and a decent one at that. Fraser Minten, I think, is probably the one I'm least optimistic about on this, but as a bottom six, smart, puck-moving center, yeah, I could see him in the NHL for sure. Easton Cowan, I think, is more on the higher end of this. I'm still a little reserved about putting him in that core category, being an elite NHL player, but as a really good middle six, 200-foot energy guy with some skill and really high levels of hockey IQ, I can't really fault much in his game, and I'm a big fan of what he brings, and I think he's a really good example of what is at the higher end of this tier. Down in the maybes category, there's a lot of interesting players here. You've got some high skill and guys like Ty Voigt and Ronnie Hirvonen and Miroslav Holinka. I wonder if there's enough there to make it to the NHL, but there's a lot of talent there. I'm really interested in Nikita Grabyankin now that he has made his trip over to North America. Topi Niemela had a pretty good season last year, although I do think there's a likelihood he struggles in the NHL at the end of the day. But then you have just really rock-solid players here like a Noah Chadwick, as well as literally all of the goaltenders in my tracking sheet for Toronto. Dennis Hildeby, Timofey Obvintsev, Vyacheslav Peksa, Artur Akhtiamov. No matter what, all of these players have looked pretty good considering where they've played. Peksa had a bit of a tough season adjusting to North America, but he has looked good overall over the course of his career, and we'll see how things go. But at least the other three are guys that I've seen quite often and I'm quite optimistic about. Dennis Hildeby had a great year with the Marlies last year, and we'll see how he does this season. And I think in the maybes category in general, I think there's a lot of interesting players for Toronto. Everyone else is pretty big here for Toronto as well. I think there's a lot of interesting players, but I don't know how much of an NHL likelihood they have. I really like Ryan Tverberg's energetic game, but is it AHL energetic or NHL energetic? William Villeneuve had a pretty decent season. Guys like Alexander Plasovsky, Victor Johansson, guys they drafted this past year, I've seen them a few times and not really blown away with what I've seen, but you've got a long development trajectory with them and you never know what could happen. Being down here isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that I think the statistical likelihood of getting to the NHL for them is a little bit steep. And time will tell, doesn't mean it's impossible, but there's an interesting group of prospects here for Toronto regardless. I think they've done really well considering the draft capital they've had over the last few years, and we'll see how things go, but I'm really optimistic about them. So that's it for the Toronto Maple Leafs. If you liked the video, click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss another one. If you really liked the video, you can go to Scouching.ca, where a subscription will get you early access to content, as well as plenty of other cool stuff like data tables for drafted and undrafted prospects, a Discord server, and exclusive written content and other stuff you can check out at Scouching.ca. So that's it for Toronto, and in our next one, we're going to look at the St. Louis Blues.